Welcome to another story written by Oracle 1. The Forbidden Rituals of the Fog-Covered Forest. Chapter 1. The fog never lifted from Black Hollow Forest. It did not thin with the sunrise or drift away when the wind passed through the valley. It lingered between the trees day and night, thick and pale, swallowing distance until the forest seemed to stretch endlessly into gray silence. Locals avoided the place. Travelers who passed through the region spoke of the forest in lowered voices, as if even mentioning it might draw unwanted attention. But Daniel Mercer had never been a man who feared old stories. He had come for answers. The dirt road leading toward the forest ended abruptly beside a rusted metal gate that hung crooked between two leaning fence posts. The sign attached to it had nearly rotted away, but the faded lettering was still barely readable through layers of moss. Black Hollow Forest. Entry prohibited. Daniel stepped out of his truck and closed the door softly behind him. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. No birds sang in the branches above. No insects buzzed in the damp air. The only sound was the slow whisper of fog sliding through the skeletal trees ahead. Daniel studied the forest carefully. Tall pines and ancient oaks crowded together so tightly that their branches formed a dark ceiling overhead. The fog drifted between them in slow curling tendrils that never seemed to disperse. A cold feeling lingered in the air. Not the simple chill of morning, but something deeper. Something older. Daniel pulled a folded map from his jacket pocket. The forest covered nearly 10 miles of land between two rural towns that had both begun shrinking decades ago. Most of the surrounding farmland had been abandoned long ago, leaving only a handful of scattered homes near the highway. But according to the map, deep inside the forest there had once been a settlement. A village that vanished nearly 80 years ago. Daniel folded the map again. The stories surrounding the disappearance had been dismissed for decades as superstition. Official reports blamed disease, migration, and economic collapse. But in recent months, hikers had begun reporting strange discoveries. Small clearings deep in the fog. Stone circles. Charred animal remains. Symbols carved into trees. Rituals. Daniel was an investigative journalist. Chasing stories like this was his work. Still, as he lifted the gate and stepped beyond it, a faint unease tugged at the back of his mind. The fog thickened almost immediately once he entered the tree line. Within 20 steps the road behind him had vanished completely. The forest floor was damp with rotting leaves that muffled his footsteps as he moved deeper between the towering trunks. Daniel switched on the flashlight clipped to his pack strap. The beam pushed through the fog in a pale cone of light. It barely reached 10 feet ahead. He walked slowly, careful to follow the narrow trail that wound between the trees. The ground dipped and rose in uneven patches, forcing him to watch his footing. Every few minutes he paused and listened. Nothing. No animals. No wind. Just silence pressing from every direction. After nearly half an hour of walking, Daniel noticed the first marking. A symbol carved into the bark of a large oak tree. He stepped closer and lifted the flashlight. The carving had been cut deep into the wood, forming a rough circle intersected by several jagged lines. It was not a symbol Daniel recognized. The edges looked fresh, recently carved. Daniel reached out and touched the groove with his fingers. The wood inside the carving was still pale. He stepped back slowly. Someone had been here not long ago. He scanned the fog around him, suddenly aware of how limited his vision had become. The forest seemed endless. The trail continued deeper into the mist. Daniel hesitated only a moment before moving forward again. The further he walked, the more carvings appeared. Some etched into tree trunks. Others scratched into stones along the path. Always the same symbol. The circle. The jagged lines. The deeper he went, the more frequently they appeared. Eventually the trail widened into a small clearing. Daniel stopped at the edge of it. The fog gathered thickly above the open ground, swirling in slow, unnatural patterns. In the center of the clearing stood a ring of standing stones. 8 of them, each one roughly 6 feet tall. Dark and weathered with age. Daniel approached cautiously. The ground inside the circle had been cleared of leaves and debris. The soil looked disturbed, recent. He crouched near one of the stones and ran his light across the surface. More carvings. Not just the symbol. Dozens of strange markings spiraled across the stone's face. Symbols layered over symbols, some deeply worn by time, others sharp and new. Daniel lifted his camera and began taking photographs. The flash burst brightly against the fog. For a brief moment the entire clearing glowed white. And in that instant Daniel thought he saw movement between the trees. A figure standing just beyond the fog. Tall, still, watching. The flash faded. The clearing returned to dim gray. Daniel lowered the camera slowly. "Hello?" His voice sounded strangely muffled in the fog. No answer came. Daniel walked to the edge of the clearing and aimed the flashlight into the trees. The beam revealed nothing but drifting mist and silent trunks stretching into darkness. He stood there for several seconds. Then he turned back toward the stone circle. Something had changed. He felt it before he saw it. The air inside the clearing felt heavier now. Almost suffocating. Daniel stepped closer to the stones again. At the center of the circle, the disturbed soil had been shaped into something deliberate. A shallow pit, blackened around the edges, as if something had burned there. Daniel crouched beside it. The smell reached him immediately. Not wood, not charcoal, something far worse. Burnt flesh. Daniel recoiled slightly. His light shifted across the pit. Something lay half buried in the ash. Small bones. Animal bones. Twisted and blackened. Daniel swallowed hard. A ritual site. Exactly what the hikers had described. He lifted the camera again, snapping several more photographs. The flash illuminated the clearing once more. And this time he saw them clearly. Figures standing between the trees. 4 of them, motionless silhouettes in the fog. Watching him, Daniel's pulse jumped. "Hey," he called. The figures did not move. They simply stood there, silent. The fog curled around them, blurring their features until they looked almost unreal. Daniel stepped toward them cautiously. The nearest figure slowly lifted its head. But the movement was wrong. Too slow. Too deliberate. Daniel stopped walking. The fog shifted. And the figure vanished. Not stepping away. Not turning. Just gone. The other silhouettes faded moments later, dissolving back into the mist. Daniel stood frozen. His heartbeat thudded loudly in his ears. The clearing felt colder now. Much colder. He turned slowly back toward the stone circle. And realized he was no longer alone. Someone was standing inside the circle. A man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that blended into the fog. His face was pale, almost colorless. Daniel had not heard him approach. "How long have you been there?" Daniel asked. The man did not answer. He simply watched Daniel with an expression that was impossible to read. Daniel forced a calm tone into his voice. "I'm just documenting the site." Still no reply. The man's eyes slowly drifted toward the pit in the center of the stones. Then back to Daniel. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. His voice sounded oddly distant, as though echoing through the fog. Daniel frowned slightly. "Why not?" The man's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because the ritual has already begun." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What ritual?" The man did not answer. Instead he raised one thin finger and pointed behind Daniel. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel turned. The fog surrounding the clearing was moving now. Not drifting, circling. The mist twisted around the stone ring in slow spiraling currents. As if the forest itself were breathing. And deep within the fog beyond the clearing, more figures were beginning to appear. Chapter 2. Daniel turned slowly back toward the man standing inside the stone circle. But the man was gone. The space where he had stood was empty. Daniel's chest tightened. He had not heard footsteps. He had not heard leaves crunch or branches shift. The man had simply vanished into the fog as if he had never been there at all. Yet the words still lingered in Daniel's mind. The ritual has already begun. A slow movement in the mist drew his attention again. The figures beyond the clearing were no longer vague silhouettes. They were stepping forward now, emerging gradually between the trees. One, then another, then several more. Daniel counted at least 8 shapes approaching through the fog. They moved with calm, deliberate steps. Not rushing, not hiding, coming directly toward the stone circle. Daniel's instincts flared. He grabbed his camera bag and backed away from the pit in the center of the stones. "Hello?" he called again. No response came. The figures continued forward. The fog thickened around them, swallowing details of their faces and bodies until they looked more like shadows than people. Daniel turned toward the trail behind him. Leaving suddenly felt like the smartest decision he had made all day. He stepped out of the circle and hurried toward the narrow path he had followed earlier. But after only a few steps, he stopped. The trail was gone. The forest ahead looked unfamiliar. The fog had swallowed every landmark. Daniel turned slowly. The clearing behind him was still there, but the path leading into it no longer looked the same. The trees had shifted, or perhaps they only seemed to. His breathing grew heavier. The figures were closer now. Close enough that Daniel could finally see their faces. Or what should have been their faces. Each of them wore a mask. Simple wooden masks carved into unnatural expressions, some smiling, some twisted into grimacing shapes. The carvings resembled the symbol he had seen etched into the trees. A circle intersected by jagged lines. The same symbol appeared on every mask. Daniel's pulse hammered. "Look, I'm leaving," he said quickly. The masked figures stopped walking. They formed a loose circle around the clearing, standing just beyond the stone ring. None of them spoke. They simply watched him. Daniel stepped backward toward the center of the clearing again. "You don't want trouble," he added. Still silence. The fog continued spiraling slowly around the stones. Daniel noticed something else then. Each of the figures carried something in their hands. Small bowls, clay or stone, difficult to see clearly through the mist. The bowls appeared blackened inside, as if they had been used for burning something. One of the figures stepped forward. Its movements were slow and careful. Daniel could hear faint sounds now, soft murmurs drifting through the fog. Whispered words, chants, low and rhythmic. The masked figure approached the stone circle and stopped just outside it. Then it raised the bowl in both hands. The others followed. 8 figures, 8 bowls. They lifted them in unison. The whispering grew louder. Daniel strained to hear the words, but they were spoken in a language he did not recognize. The sound carried a strange weight to it. Not loud, but powerful, as if the forest itself were listening. Daniel backed further into the center of the stones. "You don't have to do this," he said. No one responded. The first masked figure stepped inside the circle. Then another. The others followed slowly until all 8 of them stood between the stones. Daniel was surrounded. The chanting continued. Soft, steady. The air felt heavier with every passing second. Daniel noticed something moving inside the pit at the center of the clearing. At first he thought it was the fog settling into the ash. But the movement was too deliberate, too slow. Something beneath the burned soil was shifting. Daniel stepped away from the pit. "What is this?" he demanded. One of the figures finally spoke. "The forest remembers." The voice was distorted behind the wooden mask. Another figure added quietly, "The forest answers." The chanting continued. The bowls were lowered toward the pit. One by one, the figures poured their contents into the ash. Dark liquid spilled into the center. The smell hit Daniel immediately. Copper. Blood. Fresh blood. Daniel's stomach twisted. Are you insane? The figures ignored him. The chanting grew louder now. More urgent. The fog outside the clearing thickened until the trees beyond the stones were barely visible. Daniel felt the ground beneath his boots tremble faintly. The pit shifted again. The ash stirred. Something beneath the soil pushed upward. Daniel stared in disbelief. The earth at the center of the circle cracked open slowly. The ground was not collapsing. It was being forced apart. From below, the masked figures dropped to their knees around the pit. Their chanting rose in intensity. The fog swirled faster. The air vibrated with a low humming sound that seemed to come from deep beneath the forest floor. Daniel backed away until his shoulders struck one of the standing stones. "What are you doing?" he shouted. No one answered. The pit widened. The burned soil split apart as something beneath it pushed upward. A hand emerged from the ground. Blackened. Skeletal. Its fingers clawed at the air weakly. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Another hand appeared beside the first. Then a head slowly rose from the broken earth. The skull was covered in patches of decayed flesh. Its eye sockets glowed faintly with a sickly pale light. The chanting stopped instantly. Silence crashed over the clearing. The thing pulled itself free of the soil. Its bones cracked softly as it straightened. Daniel's mind refused to process what he was seeing. The corpse stood upright in the pit. Tall, thin. Its limbs moved stiffly, like a puppet being forced to remember how to walk. One of the masked figures stood slowly. "The forest accepts the offering," the figure whispered. The corpse turned its head. Slowly. Toward Daniel. The faint light inside its empty eyes brightened. Daniel's body went cold. "No," he muttered. The corpse stepped out of the pit. Its bones scraped against the stones as it moved. The masked figures bowed their heads. None of them looked surprised. As if this had happened many times before. The corpse raised its head toward the fog. And the forest answered. Shapes began appearing between the trees. More figures emerging through the mist. Not masked this time. These shapes moved differently. Slow. Stiff. Dead. Dozens of them. Corpses stumbling out of the fog. Their bodies rotted and broken. Their eyes glowing with the same pale light. Daniel felt terror claw its way through his chest. This isn't possible. The first corpse, the one that had risen from the pit, stepped closer to him. Its head tilted slightly. Studying him, Daniel backed away from the stone circle. The masked figures parted to let him pass. They were not stopping him. They were letting him go. "The forest chooses," one of them whispered. Daniel turned and ran. He plunged into the fog between the trees. Branches tore at his jacket as he forced his way through the forest. Behind him, the chanting resumed. Louder than before. Deeper. The ground trembled faintly with each echoing word. Daniel did not stop running. He had no idea which direction he was heading anymore. The fog had swallowed the trail completely. The forest looked identical in every direction. But something far worse crept into his mind as he ran. The masked figures had not tried to stop him. They had let him leave. They had even moved aside to give him a path. As if his escape had been expected. As if it had been necessary. Daniel slowed gradually. His breath burned in his chest. The fog thinned slightly ahead. He stumbled into another clearing. And immediately stopped. More stones stood here. Another circle. Larger than the first. The ground at its center was already blackened. Already prepared. The same symbol carved into every surface. Daniel felt dread settle deep in his stomach. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Slow. Uneven. Rotting limbs dragging across the forest floor. Daniel turned. Shapes were emerging from the fog. The corpses from the first clearing. Walking toward him. Not dozens this time, hundreds. And among them, the masked figures followed calmly behind. One of them lifted a wooden mask slightly, just enough for Daniel to see the faint smile beneath it. "The forest did not want your story," the figure said softly. "It wanted you." The chanting began again, and this time, Daniel realized he was standing in the center of the ritual circle. Chapter 3. The chanting rolled through the fog like distant thunder. Daniel stood frozen at the center of the stone circle as the sound grew louder with every passing second. The forest around him had come alive. Not with animals, not with wind, but with movement. The dead were emerging from the mist in every direction. Their bodies stumbled forward in slow, uneven steps. Some dragged broken limbs across the ground. Others moved stiffly, their bones grinding against decayed joints with quiet cracking sounds. Their eyes all glowed with the same pale light. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They spread out along the edge of the clearing, forming a silent wall of rotting bodies between the trees. Daniel backed slowly toward one of the standing stones. His mind struggled to accept what he was seeing. This was impossible. This was madness. But the ground beneath his boots vibrated faintly with each word of the ritual, and the fog above the clearing churned in spiraling currents like a living storm. The masked figures entered the circle behind him. 8 of them again, just like the first clearing. They took their places beside each of the stones. The chanting deepened, slower now, more deliberate. Daniel forced himself to speak. "You don't have to do this." One of the masked figures stepped closer. "The forest has waited a very long time." Daniel glanced toward the approaching corpses. They had stopped moving. Every one of them stood perfectly still now, watching. The rituals were never meant to summon them. The masked figure continued quietly. They were meant to feed the forest. Daniel's pulse pounded. Feed it what? The figure tilted its head slightly. "You." Daniel's body went cold. The figure gestured toward the center of the clearing. Daniel followed the movement with his eyes. The ground beneath him had begun to crack. Thin lines spread slowly across the dark soil. Something beneath the earth was pushing upward. The same thing he had seen in the first clearing. But this time the ground split wider. Deeper. The soil collapsed inward as the pit opened beneath him. Daniel jumped back just as the earth caved in. The pit revealed a black hollow descending into darkness. Cold air poured out of it. Air that smelled of damp stone and something ancient. Something that had been buried far too long. The chanting reached its peak. The masked figures raised their hands toward the fog. The corpses around the clearing lifted their heads in unison. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run. But every direction was blocked. The forest had closed around the clearing. The dead stood shoulder to shoulder between the trees. Daniel turned toward the pit again. Movement stirred deep inside the darkness below. Something was climbing. Not a corpse. Not a skeleton. Something far larger. Daniel stumbled backward. "What is that?" The masked figure answered calmly. "The heart of the forest." A shape emerged from the pit. At first Daniel could only see movement, long limbs rising slowly through the darkness. Then the creature pulled itself into the clearing. It was enormous. Its body looked almost human, but stretched and twisted in unnatural ways. Its skin was pale gray and covered in thin root-like veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. Long black hair hung across its face. Its arms dragged across the ground as it climbed from the pit, fingers digging into the soil like claws. The chanting stopped instantly. Silence filled the clearing. The creature stood slowly. It was nearly 10 feet tall. Its head lifted, and Daniel saw its face. Or what had once been a face. The skin had fused with bark and moss. Roots had grown through the hollow spaces where eyes should have been. And inside those hollow sockets glowed the same pale light as the corpses in the forest. Daniel's voice trembled. "What is it?" The masked figure answered. "The first one." Daniel's mind raced. "The first, what?" The creature stepped forward slowly. The ground trembled beneath its weight. "The first sacrifice," the figure said quietly. Daniel felt the words sink into his chest like ice. "The forest grows from death," the figure continued. "It has always needed a beginning." The creature's head turned toward Daniel. Its glowing gaze fixed directly on him. Daniel took another step backward. His foot struck the edge of the pit. He was trapped. "You've been doing this for years," he said. "For decades." The figure nodded. "Longer." Daniel stared at the creature. "This thing, you made it." "No," the figure corrected gently. "We fed it." The creature raised one long arm slowly. Roots hanging from its fingers swayed in the cold air. Daniel looked around desperately. The corpses, the masked figures, the fog, everything felt unreal. Then the realization struck him. "You said the forest chose me." The masked figure nodded again. "Yes." Daniel's voice rose. "Why me?" The figure reached up slowly and removed the wooden mask. The face beneath it was pale and familiar. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. It belonged to a woman he had interviewed 2 weeks ago in the nearby town. A quiet librarian who had given him directions toward the forest. She smiled faintly. "You came here looking for the truth." Daniel stared at her. "You sent me here." She nodded. "We all did." Daniel looked at the other figures. One by one they removed their masks. Every face was familiar. The gas station attendant, the motel clerk, the old man who had warned him about the forest. Every person he had encountered since arriving in the town. Every one of them had led him closer to the forest. Closer to this clearing. Closer to the ritual. "You planned this," Daniel whispered. The woman smiled again. "The forest needs someone new." Daniel's gaze drifted back toward the towering creature. "The first sacrifice grows weak," she continued softly. "It needs a successor." The creature stepped closer. Its long arms stretched toward Daniel. Roots and vines twisted along its fingers. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No." The woman's smile faded slightly. "You brought the final piece yourself." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" She nodded toward the camera bag still slung across his shoulder. Daniel hesitated. Then he slowly removed the bag and opened it. Inside were the photographs he had taken. Images of the first ritual circle. Images of the corpses. Images of the creature rising from the pit. Daniel suddenly understood. The ritual needed a witness. The woman nodded. The forest must be remembered. The creature's hand closed around Daniel's shoulder. Its grip was cold and impossibly strong. Daniel tried to pull away. The roots wrapping around the creature's fingers began spreading across his jacket. Crawling across his arms. Across his chest. The ground beneath his feet trembled. The fog above the clearing began to descend slowly toward the pit. Daniel struggled harder. "What happens to me?" The woman answered calmly. "You become the forest." The creature pulled him closer. The roots tightened. They pierced through his jacket. Through his skin. Pain exploded through his body as the vines forced their way deeper. Daniel screamed. The corpses around the clearing lowered their heads. The chanting began again. Low. Slow. The creature lifted Daniel from the ground and carried him toward the pit. The darkness inside it seemed endless. Daniel's vision blurred. The roots spread across his body like veins. They climbed his neck, wrapped around his face. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the woman lifting the camera from his bag. She raised it calmly, and took one final photograph. The flash lit the clearing. For a single moment the forest glowed white. Then the light vanished. The fog slowly settled back over the clearing. The corpses returned to the trees. The masked figures walked quietly away. And deep within the pit, something new began to grow. Months later, Hikers passing near the edge of Black Hollow Forest would sometimes notice strange carvings appearing on the trees. A circle, intersected by jagged lines. If they walked far enough into the fog, they might even discover a clearing with a ring of standing stones. And if they looked closely at the carvings etched across those stones, they might notice one symbol that had not been there before. A human figure with roots growing from its body. Its face frozen in silent terror. Watching the forest forever. For more stories, like and subscribe.